Hey folks, how you doing? Dave McRae here. Okay, in this video, we're going to be talking about some of my favorite old school horror movies. Now, depending on how old you are, I'm 39, old school to you might be different than what old school is to me. Old school horror movies for me are the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. If you're significantly older than me, old school to you might be the 40s and the 50s. If you're significantly younger than me, old school for you might be the 90s, or maybe even the early 2000s, right? So it does all depend on where you fall, but for me, old school horror is the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, primarily the 70s and the 80s because I'm 39. So that's sort of what I grew up with through the 80s when I was a kid and when I really got into horror films, right? Now, before we get to the list, I want to give some shout outs here. So this is the first time I'm doing this. I want to give some shout outs to some of my patrons on my Patreon that have been kind enough to support the channel each and every month. And let's do that now, shall we?
Lester Ramsey, Judy Baker, David Ferguson, Jordan and Lydia, James Graham, Terrence Howell, Josh Lee, and Andrew James. You are all my patrons now. Or do you want this one instead? Now, on with the show.
In this video, I'm going to give you a top 10 list followed by some honorable mentions. Now, as I mentioned before, in no way is this a complete list. There are so many good ones I wanted to choose, but for the sake of time, I had to be decisive and pick sort of the ones that I tend to gravitate towards the most, okay? So if yours, if your favorites don't appear on here, that doesn't mean that I don't think they're equally as good and that they could easily be on here. These are just the ones that I tend to gravitate towards the most. Now, again, this is not a formal movie review. I'm not reviewing each and every movie here because that would take way too much time. And of course, I don't do formal movie reviews on this channel. But let's get started. So in no particular order, except for the first one, this is a pattern that I'm noticing when I do these videos, that it is in no particular order, but the very first one in the top left usually ends up being my favorite of the particular genre we're talking about, and this is no exception. So my favorite horror movie of all time is John Carpenter's 1978 classic Halloween. And what is there to say that I have not already said about Halloween ad nauseum? So you guys know why I love it. So let's move on. Okay, next to that is 1968's Rosemary's Baby, directed by Roman Polanski and starring Mia Farrow. Now, despite what you might think about Roman Polanski and his personal shit, which of course is pretty shitty, the guy directs good movies. It's kind of like, Woody Allen. I mean, he's got some personal shit too, but he directs good movies. You got to give credit where credit is due, unfortunately, in this case. And this is a classic horror movie, not only of its time, but of its genre. Of course, it's a supernatural possession kind of film. And this is great. This is essentially about a young couple, Mia Farrow's character and her husband's character. Her husband's character, I forget his name now, but he's an aspiring actor, and they move into this old apartment building in New York City. And everybody in the building is very welcoming to them, for the most part, I think. And nothing seems to be out of the ordinary. Nothing seems to be wrong. And this is I love this because it reminds me of the beginning of Raiders of the Lost Ark, that scene where Indiana Jones and his buddy there are about to go and get the fertility idol right before the big ball drops, right? And his buddy's like, well, it's not really his buddy because, he double crosses him. But at the time, we think, okay, this is his friend, right? And he's like, we must hurry. There's nothing to fear here. And Indiana Jones grabs him and throws him up against the wall and is like, that's what scares me. And I love that line because it's very true, right? Like things seem a little too pristine, a little too easy. There's gotta be something I'm missing here, right? This can't be just, it can't be this easy. And I think of that when I watch this film because, the neighbors seem genuinely nice. Sure, they're a little quirky and they're a little sort of maybe eccentric, but they seem to genuinely care about the well-being of this couple. At least we're led to believe that. And, but almost to the detriment of the narrative because it's like, something doesn't seem right here. Anyway, Mia Farrow's character ends up pregnant, and I think we all know where this is going. But the mood is great, the atmosphere is great, that slow burn that I really like is great. Oh yeah, even the doctor in this film, her doctor that she sees because she's pregnant, he seems really chill and fine and okay, and like everybody seems pretty cool. Like everybody seems to genuinely care about her well-being, right? But things are not what they seem. And I love it. I think it's a great film for the genre. It's simple. It's not sensational in the slightest. But you are hooked because of the characters, the pacing. I remember when I first watched it years ago, I remember thinking, there's gotta be something I'm missing here. People just seem a little, you know what I mean? Just love it. It's great. Anyway, let's move on here. So next is 1982's Poltergeist. Oh, one of my favorites of all time. Executive producer Steven Spielberg, directed by Tobe Hooper. Now, depending on who you believe, some people believe that it was Steven Spielberg that pretty much directed this movie. It was his visual style, it was his sort of pacing, it was his kind of a film when dealing with this subject matter. I mean, let's not forget Tobe Hooper's real claim to fame is the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And to go from that into Poltergeist, some people were like, this just doesn't feel quite, this feels more Spielberg than anything else. But that was sort of hearsay, it was conspiracy theory, there was some, behind the scenes drama, apparently dealing with the film. But then John Leonetti, the director of 2014's Annabelle, came forward in an interview with, I believe it was Independent. I have it up here. This interview was last year. I'm not sure if Independent is the original source of the interview or if Independent picked it up. But nonetheless, John Leonetti back in 1982 was a first camera assistant, I believe, on the Poltergeist movie. And he had this to say about Poltergeist, and I quote, "It was a very intense, very fun, very technical movie to work on. There's a lot going on, and candidly, Steven Spielberg directed that movie. There's no question. However, Tobe Hooper, I adore. I love that man so much. Hooper was so nice and just happy to be there. He creatively did have input, but Spielberg developed the movie, and it was his to direct, except there was anticipation of a director's strike, so he was the producer, but really, he directed it in case there was going to be a strike, and Tobe was cool with that. It wasn't anything against Tobe. Every once in a while, he would actually leave the set and let Tobe do a few things just because, but really, Steven directed it. So, and this is an exact quote from John Leonetti, the director of Annabelle, 2014's Annabelle, who was first camera assistant on 1982's Poltergeist. So, take that with a grain of salt, take it for what it is, but those rumors have been swirling around Poltergeist for quite some time. Now, what I love about this movie, though, is that, again, it's got a bit of that slow burn. Now, I know there's some sensational things throughout, the movie in the second act, I believe, like when the tree, comes alive and comes through the window and gets Bobby, but really, the real sensational stuff doesn't happen until the third act of the movie. And it's beautifully shot, the pacing is great, there's this sense of realism, like grounded in reality, and I know things get crazy towards the end of the picture, but Poltergeist is that it's not out of the gate crazy, it's not out of the gate sensational, it's got, this sense of there's this family that's really going through this. One of my favorite scenes, Carol Ann is, seated on the kitchen floor and she's got the football helmet on and she's just dragged across the kitchen floor. Like, that's creepy. It's because it's a very sort of supernatural thing that's happening in an otherwise very ordinary environment and situation. So something extraordinary is happening, but in a very sort of grounded environment. So we have this little girl that's being pulled across this kitchen floor, but it's daytime out, it's sunny, the birds are chirping, there's nothing else weird going on. It's just like, what is this? Like, what is this thing that's happening right now in the middle of our fucking kitchen? It's brilliantly done. I love the scene where the mother leaves the kitchen and she comes back in and all the chairs are stacked up on top of each other, on top of the kitchen table, and there wasn't even a cut that we could see. That was amazing. Really well done. Fantastic post-production editing. It's that kind of shit, right? Really awesome shit. Like, it doesn't really get overly sensational till, like I said, the third act of the movie, which is understandable because, you're bringing it home now, right? Anyway, an absolute classic of the genre. Okay, moving right along to 1984's A Nightmare on Elm Street, directed by Wes Craven. This is undoubtedly my favorite slasher movie of all time, and you could make the argument that it is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, slasher movie of all time. This is my favorite, not only probably my favorite slasher, but my favorite Freddy Krueger movie. This is because Freddy Krueger's fucking scary in this movie. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Yeah, but Dave, you said that Halloween was your favorite horror movie of all time, and Halloween's a slasher movie. Yes, I know that traditionally Halloween is considered a slasher movie because, where else are you really going to put it? We have a guy with a knife chasing teenagers. But at the end of the day, I don't really consider John Carpenter's Halloween a slasher. When I think of slasher, I think of blood, guts, and I think of, intense violence. And you don't get that with Halloween. Halloween is more of theater of the mind. It's more of a psychological mystery thriller kind of thing. That's how I see it. Now, I've talked about A Nightmare on Elm Street on this channel ad nauseum before as well, so many of you probably already know why I love this movie so much. Freddy Krueger is fucking scary in this movie, and for me, the epitome of Freddy Krueger is this Freddy Krueger in this movie. Not cracking the one-liners left, right, and center. Like, I think the only funny line really he has in the movie is probably when he says, "I'm your boyfriend now," which is sort of the extent of his comedy career in this film. But it's creepy and it's eerie and it works for that scene, right? Yeah, he's dark. He's often in shadow. We don't see him all that clearly, really. I love that dream sequence. My favorite, of course, is the Tina one, but the entire thing, not just, what happens in the room with her on the ceiling, the entire moment where she wakes up, she thinks she's awake, but she's actually dreaming, and she tries to wake up Rod, right? And Freddy is like throwing those stones against the window, and she gets up and she's like, "Who is that?" And you're like, "Tina." It's so creepy and eerie. And then she walks downstairs, opens the front door, walks out onto the front porch. Obviously, she's still dreaming. We don't know this at this point if you're watching it for the first time. And she's like, "Who is that?" And you hear this one deep, very deep, "Tina." Oh, man, it gets me every fucking time. And it's just awesome. And then, of course, the alleyway with the long arms. And please, God, this is God. I just love it. Love that shit. And then, of course, it plays out with her on the ceiling and the blood. Just awesome. That is one of the most iconic moments in horror history. I mean, it's amazing. Now, what I also like about the overall sort of visual aesthetic and look of A Nightmare on Elm Street, and I've said this before in past videos where I've been talking about this movie and the franchise, for me, there's like this dream-like hue over the entire picture. So even when you're not in the dream world, it's almost like the whole movie is in some sort of alternate reality, like some sort of dreamish sort of kind of uncertainty. Even when there's nothing particularly eerie or creepy going on, you still feel sort of eerie and creeped out because of, the score, right? The classic Elm Street music and the way that, the picture looks during the daytime with the sun shining, and like everything just feels like you're in some sort of daze, like you're in some sort of haze, like almost like you're waking up from a bender or, something. Like it's just like you're not all quite there. I've always felt that about the visual aesthetic of A Nightmare on Elm Street, and I absolutely love that. I love all the characters. I love that we get to know the characters as well. Sort of, I mean, it doesn't take very long. It moves, at a fairly fast pace. But one of the downfalls of the remake from 2010 was when we met Nancy, she was already in her funk. Like she was already being tortured by Freddy. When we met her friends, same sort of thing. So there was this emotional disconnect because we weren't really on this journey together with them. We were watching from a distance and from afar. Whereas in the original A Nightmare on Elm Street from 1984, we're introduced to Nancy and Tina already sort of going through those dreams, but the hardcore moments haven't hit them yet. So there's that little doorway, even though it's slight, there's that little doorway where we can become sort of more emotionally connected and sort of latch on to these characters. It's my favorite of the series. It's my favorite Freddy Krueger movie. And I think it's one of the greatest slasher films ever made for a variety of reasons. I have Elm Street videos on my channel that you can check out if you want to know more. Okay, moving right along is 1974's Black Christmas, a good Canadian horror movie shot right here in Toronto. And this is, I gotta tell you, this this is right up my alley when it comes to the slow burn, the what you think you see, what you think you hear, keeping our main antagonist sort of often, we don't know what he looks like, and then we only really reveal him when we see his eye. Do you remember that scene when we see his eye? Oh my God, that's awesome. And then the phone calls. It's just awesome. Like, it's scary fucking shit. So somebody doing that to you back in the early 70s was very scary. And, there was this sense of vulnerability that you had back then, more so than you have now, because of how we're all connected in terms of social media through our cell phones and, WhatsApp and Messenger and Facebook and Twitter and LinkedIn. It's harder to do that today than it would have been 40 years ago or 45 years ago. I mean, just unbelievably scary. So it might not seem like a big deal to a younger generation today, but in the 70s, and somebody played that sort of a trick on you, that's frightening, very frightening, and especially at a sorority house with a bunch of young women. So the whole concept was great. And the fact that we never saw our antagonist, ever. You never, ever saw him. You just saw his eye. That's the closest thing you ever saw. And that eye is fucking scary, man. That is a classic shot. Love it. And of course, it also has got John Saxon, I think his name is, the dad from A Nightmare on Elm Street, 10 years before Elm Street, of course, but he's in this movie, and he's awesome. I think he plays a cop too, actually. I think he plays a cop in this one as well. He brings some credibility to the film, because obviously he was a fairly well-known actor then too. I absolutely love the way the film ends, where the camera is just pulling out. There's no music. I think you might hear some carolers, perhaps, off in the distance, because obviously this movie takes place at Christmas time, and you definitely hear the phone ringing from within the house, but it's just pulling away from the attic window, and you see that woman in the chair, right, that you see on the poster there, and nobody's found her. Like, I mean, it's just pulling away, and it's just, it's awesome, just awesome. I love it. Love that movie, that slow burn, real eerie, creepy. It's classic suspense, mood, and atmosphere. So if you haven't seen Black Christmas, check it out. Okay, moving right along to 1975's Jaws. This is undoubtedly one of my favorite, not only horror movies of all time, but one of my favorite movies of all time. And for a long time, I didn't really think of this movie as a horror movie. I mean, I know it is, per se, and I know there are a lot of horrific things that happen in this movie, no doubt. And I know that back in the 80s and in the 90s, when you'd walk into a video store, whether it was a big blockbuster chain or whether it was a small independent shop, Jaws, by and large, would be in the horror section, because where else are you going to put it? But I never, when I think of horror movies, I don't tend to think of Jaws. I think growing up, I always thought of Jaws as this suspenseful thriller. And I think you could make an argument for that. But I know that a general consensus among the general movie-going audience is that it is also a horror movie. You could lump it in there. And I certainly don't want to miss it, because it's not only one of my favorite horror movies per se, it's one of my favorite movies of all time. And Jaws was the very first movie in motion picture history to cross the $100 million mark at the box office, and it went on to gross a total of $260 million. And Jaws, of course, as we all know, was the first movie to really set the stage for the summer blockbuster. Before Jaws, there were no summer blockbusters. There were no movies that you could look forward to each and every year in the summer that were coming out, big bona fide blockbusters, and Jaws was the first movie to do that. And of course, it went on to gross, as I said, $260 million at the box office, becoming the highest grossing movie in motion picture history, until 2 years later when Star Wars knocked it out of the park. So yeah, what is there not to love about this film? I mean, Jaws, the suspense is great. The fact that they had, so many technical problems on set with the shark actually, worked in favor of the movie, because the shark was supposed to be seen long before we actually saw the shark. But because they had so many problems with the shark in the water, Spielberg had to improvise and use sort of glimpses of the shark, the tail, the fin, really rely on John Williams' amazing score to let you know when the shark was in the area. And that actually worked in the movie's favor. And of course, it's become known as the Jaws effect, right? That slow burn, keeping your main antagonist, your main boogeyman, whatever that boogeyman is, whether it's a spirit, a ghost, a killer, like Michael Myers or Freddy, or a shark, to always sort of keep it in the shadows and keep it at bay, and it really worked. I don't know if the film, had we seen the shark in plain day, by the second act of the movie, I'm not entirely sure it would have had the same impact that the movie does today. And I think it still holds up. To this day, I don't think CGI has mastered the look of a shark. I think Jaws today looks like a real shark. I mean, yes, there's moments where you might be able to tell that, yeah, okay, it's a little, but by and large, that shark, and I'm not talking about the shots where they actually used a real shark, okay? I'm talking about the mechanical shark Bruce in this movie. There are moments and shots that I still think it looks fucking terrifying and real, like legitimately like a 25-foot great white shark. And I think it still holds up today. It still holds up today. It is still a scary, suspenseful movie today. Anyways, I could go into great detail about Jaws and all the great characters and that great speech that Robert Shaw's character of Quint said, on the orca, and all the tiny nuances and details of all the character development, but it would take way too long. Let's just say Jaws is a fucking amazing movie. It's one of my favorite horror movies, quote unquote, because again, I sort of, consider it thriller suspense, but undoubtedly one of my favorite movies of all time. Love Jaws. Okay, moving right along is Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, starring Jack Nicholson and Shelley Duvall. Now, this is the kind of movie, because it's a heavy-duty psychological horror, this is the kind of movie that I could talk for 2.5 hours about the deep-seated symbolism in the movie, about, Stanley Kubrick, about how it differs very much from the book. Stephen King hated the movie when it came out, and but there's some interesting things about The Shining. Some things I think people are sort of, okay, I think you're, thinking too much about that. And then there's other things where you're like, well, if anybody's going to do it, if anybody's going to put some symbolism or some hidden meaning in this movie, it's going to be Stanley Kubrick. I mean, for those of you that don't know, Stanley Kubrick was one of the most meticulous, stubborn filmmakers who ever graced the silver screen. I mean, this guy, every single thing that he would put in one of his movies had a purpose, whether it was in the foreground, the background, whatever it was, it had meaning. Things that seemed like mistakes weren't mistakes. They were calculated, creative choices that had specific meaning to the overall narrative. That's how crazy genius this guy was and how intense some of his films could be. So again, to go into huge detail on The Shining would take up a lot of time here, but just know that it is one of my favorite horror movies of all time for many different reasons, under many different levels. I get something new out of it every time I watch it. I think it's creepy and it's eerie, but it's the deep layers, it's the multi-layers that The Shining has that really helps for me to respect what Kubrick was doing, even though it differs greatly from the book. And of course, they're making a sequel to The Shining called Dr. Sleep, which is based on the novel by Stephen King of the same name, I think. And Ewan McGregor has signed on to play the young Danny, the little boy from the first book and the first movie. He signed on to play the adult Danny. So should be interesting. Now, as far as I know, I don't think this is going to be a direct sequel to Stanley Kubrick's The Shining. I stand to be corrected, but I believe this is going to be a direct sequel to The Shining, the book, the novelization version, which, as I just said, varies very much so from the movie that Kubrick did. Now, I mean, there are some parallels and there are some things that are the same, but for the most part, there are vast differences. So much so that it is almost like it's a completely different thing. So, interesting, nonetheless. Keep your eyes open for Dr. Sleep with Ewan McGregor. Okay, moving right along is another one from 1980. 1980's Friday the 13th, directed by Sean S. Cunningham. Now, this is my favorite Friday the 13th movie. I like part 1, 2, 3, and 4. For me, that's sort of the series. I think part 6 is fun, and it's definitely very, late 80s, although I think it was 1986, right? Late 80s horror, or mid 80s horror, I guess, depending on where you want to, where you feel 1986 falls. But nonetheless, yeah, Part 6, Jason Lives, is fun. It's probably the best Friday the 13th outside of 1 through 4. And certainly probably that was sort of the last good Friday the 13th movie, in my opinion, was Part 6. But for me, the first 4 is the series. I think if they had ended it with Friday the 13th, the final chapter, I think that would have been a nice, clean, done and done. And then 35 years later, right now, you could reboot the series. But that being said, the very first one is my favorite, even though Jason is not the killer, because you've heard me say this before on this channel, because of the psychological component to it. I love the fact that there is, we don't know who the killer is. We're only, whenever the killer is on screen, it's always through the POV shot, point of view, for those of you that don't know what that means. And we don't find out who the killer is until like the last, 15, 20 minutes of the movie. And it's a woman. And in 1980, that was really risky. That was very different. Okay. I mean, this isn't 2018 where to put, a woman as a killer is sort of like, yeah, whatever. I mean, this is 1980. Nobody expected the killer at the end of this movie to be a woman, let alone a 50-something-year-old woman, right? I love that sort of angle to the narrative. I thought that was smart. Also, she's a little crazy. And here we have like the darkness in this movie is fantastic. Now, it was a low-budget film, and that could be primarily the reason why, but it works so well. When they're out in the rain, out in the woods, you only see where their flashlight beams are pointed. You don't see in any great detail their surroundings of where they are. And I love that. It gives this real hardcore sense of claustrophobia, right? It's very claustrophobic. I really like that. And, if this movie was made today, it would be a higher budget. They'd have all these lights set up. You'd be able to see them really clearly out in the woods at night, and they would justify, the light source as moonlight more than likely. But in this movie, there's no moonlight. It's just really dark, and you just kind of see, they will show the moon. Okay. Don't get me wrong. They do show the moon. But when we're down on the ground in the rain and, they're going from site to site, with, the flashlights, it's really pitch black. And I absolutely love that scene where there's the counselor in her bed and she's reading, right? And it's raining outside, and all you hear from outside is something like, "Help me, help me." I mean, that's fucking creepy, and it does sound like a little boy. So, we're led to believe by the end of the movie that there's this crazy fucking 55-year-old woman running around outside. "Help me, mommy. Kill her, mommy. Kill her." I mean, it's just like, what the fuck? I love that psychological component to the slow burn of Friday the 13th. Now, there's no doubt it's a slasher movie, 100%. A lot of blood, a lot of gore, but I just love that element to it. And I think that's why it's my favorite, and you sort of lose that element. You certainly absolutely lose it as the series goes on, but you begin to lose it with part 2 and 3. I thought it was great. Yeah, definitely one of my favorites of all time, and you can sort of watch the other videos on my channel where I talk about Friday the 13th to find out more about why I love it and what I don't like about the series. Okay, moving right along this is one of my favorite horror movies of all time. 1978's Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which of course is a remake of the 1956 film of the same name. Now, this movie stars Donald Sutherland, Jeff Goldblum, and Leonard Nimoy. And this movie is essentially about these gelatinous alien beings, so to speak, that come from deep space, and they wind up in San Francisco here on Earth, and they fall from the sky, and they happen to pepper all these leaves and plant life. And they grow into these beautiful sort of pink flowers, gargantuan flowers, like almost the size of sunflowers, if not bigger. And people think they're beautiful, and they start taking them into their homes, and they're wonderful and all this shit. But what ends up happening is that, for example, people begin to wake up the next day and they notice that their significant others are no longer acting sort of the same way. So, you might wake up the next day and your husband or boyfriend or mother or father or, whatever the case is, they're very calm, cool, collected, very stoic, not showing, a lot of emotion, almost like they're not themselves because maybe they aren't. But anyway, I won't go into great detail because I don't want to give it away, but this is a good horror movie. Don't let the title fool you. I know it's a bit of a corny title because obviously it is based on the original film from 1956, where you got a lot of titles like that from the 40s, the 50s, a lot of, invasion from space and, all these sort of corny kind of comic booky titles. So don't let the title fool you, even though it's called Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Sounds kind of corny. No, this is a fucking legit horror movie. For a 70s horror movie. If you love that slow burn, that mood, that eeriness, that creepiness, that pending sort of apocalyptic kind of doom, but in a very subtle sort of slow moving way, you're going to love Invasion of the Body Snatchers. This is classic 70s horror, one of my favorite horror movies of all time. Again, I could go into detail, but I just don't want to give too much away because I don't know who's seen it and who hasn't. This is undoubtedly my favorite Donald Sutherland movie, and it might be my favorite horror movie from the 70s outside of Halloween. It's rivaling Black Christmas. For me, those are like, ooh, it's tough, man. Another great one. Okay, and last on the list here is 1973's The Exorcist. What is there to say that hasn't already been said about The Exorcist? I love the slow burn of this movie. I love that when there's nothing particularly creepy happening on screen, you feel creepy and eerie watching the movie, very much kind of like you do in a lot of these films that I've mentioned here today. There's this wonderful shot, whenever I think of The Exorcist, there's this wonderful shot of the door where Reagan is. She's already in the room not feeling well, and the door is closed, and the camera is moving very slowly up on the door. And it's just like, oh man, there's just something, it's just a great shot. I know a lot of people are probably thinking, okay, that creeped you out. But again, I'm coming at this from sort of a filmmaking perspective, right? Not just a fan, but as a filmmaker. So, I see things like that, shots, angles, moments, lighting, where I'm like, oh, I really like that. Oh, that's creepy. Oh, that's eerie. Where the average film goer may be like, whatever, I don't, it doesn't really have any effect on me. And that's totally understandable. I get that. And when I see that shot, it's nothing crazy, but every time I see that shot, I think to myself, oh man, that's creepy, because it's almost like it's foreshadowing this impending doom that is about to happen later on in the movie, behind this door. What's behind this door? It's just, I love it. Some of my favorite stuff with The Exorcist actually has nothing to do with the third act of the movie, with all of the, the head turning and the barfing and the fuck me, and all that kind of shit. Like, that stuff's great because now you've gone into horror territory, full-on possession, something we haven't really seen in a horror movie up to that point. So, I get it. I get that that's classic Exorcist shit. But everything from the first act and the second act leading up to that, all of the dialogue and all of that slow burn, and watching, Reagan's sort of downfall and the spider walk down the stairs and the peeing on the floor when, her mother has those guests over, and just the home becoming very eerie, and this sense of there's something in the home. There's a very eeriness, the mother almost feels it. There's nothing really creepy happening, but she gets this sense that there's a presence there. Just really, I love that shit about The Exorcist. So you can go to the third act where the exorcism actually happens and all of the crazy sensational shit, and that stuff's great. But I like a lot of the build up to that shit, because without that build up, without that, impending doom like you get in Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Black Christmas, Halloween, Poltergeist, Rosemary's Baby, The Shining, a lot of these movies have that in common, right? That slow burn and that impending sort of doom that we're building to something. Not all horror movies are like that, and certainly not all slasher films are like that, but the ones that do it and do it well are fantastic. And The Exorcist, for me, love the third act, but it's that first act and that second act that really is like, oh, this is I'm not a religious person at all, but I'm getting creeped out. This is great shit. Anyways, folks, those are my top 10 in no particular order except for the first one. Let's move on to some honorable mentions now. 1988's Child's Play, 1979's The Amityville Horror, 1986's House. This is a great movie. This is more like a comedy horror, but I love this movie, and I never get tired of watching it. 1981's Halloween 2 and 1985's A Nightmare on Elm Street 2. And why not? Let's add 3 more in there. 1980's The Fog, one of my favorite Carpenter movies of all time, no doubt about it. Love the soundtrack. soundtrack to that movie too. We have 1974's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and 1980's The Changeling. 1980 again. 1980 was a good year for horror. So yeah, now again, if your favorite horror movies, old school horror movies did not end up on this list, that doesn't mean that I don't agree with you or would not agree with you that they would be worthy to be on this list. These are some of my favorite old school horror movies that I tend to gravitate towards the most. But I could have easily put 30 movies on this list, but again, I had to be decisive for the sake of time. Anyways, folks, my name's Dave McRae. Comment below and let me know your thoughts. I want to know, what are some of your favorite old school horror movies from the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s? Or hell, even go further back to the 40s and the 50s. Let me know what they are. I would love to know. I also have another video coming soon, hopefully sooner rather than later, where I talk about some of my favorite modern horror movies. So that I would consider anything from maybe the late 90s up until now. Horror is, I'm really picky when it comes to horror, so this one's going to be very interesting, especially when it comes to modern horror. Very picky. So this one's going to be fun. So hopefully that'll come soon. That's on the list of things to get done. If you want to follow me on Facebook, you can at facebook.com/manythingsdavemcrae. McRae is MCRAE. The link is in the description. That's where I tend to post in the meantime and in between time. So please follow me there. As well, if you want to help support the channel each and every month via Patreon, you can. That link is in the description. We are up to 60 patrons. Just a reminder, if we can get to 100 total, it doesn't matter which level you choose. If we can get to 100 total, all your names will go into a random draw to win a 12.5-inch replica Lamson Michael Myers knife, the same one I used in that little short that I uploaded back in February called The Shape Attack. So if you want to get in on that, the Patreon link is in the description. So yeah, in the meantime and in between time, I will talk to you guys soon. Cheers.